Afternoon, everyone. The time is 4 o'clock on the dot. We'll call the Anchorage School District School Board 4 p.m. work session to order. Today is February 7th. We're here in the boardroom.
Recording in progress.
Member Lessons?
Here.
President Bellamy?
Here.
Member Donnelly? Member Higgins? Member Holloman? Member Jacobs?
Present.
Member Wilson?
Thank you, Ms. Foster. All right, first up on our agenda is requests for information. My understanding is that we don't have any unsorted RFIs. Are there any additional items we need to add to the RFI log? Seeing none, we'll move on to item C on our agenda, budget brief. Dr. Bryant, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon, ASD board and community. We are approaching the finish line for passing a balanced fiscal year 24 budget. This has been a comprehensive 6+ month process, and we look forward to closing out this budget cycle and starting the initial planning for fiscal year 25. While this major milestone is nearly behind us, I hope to transition our focus to academic outcomes and our goals and guardrails moving forward. Today, we'll provide one of our last overviews of fiscal year 24 budget in preparation for a vote on February 21. Also, one topic that was originally raised as a budget solution was moving 6th grade to middle school. We are now interested in continuing that conversation, but not for budgetary reasons, but because of a number of academic and extracurricular opportunities that it could unlock for our 6th grade students. We'll have a slide that provides an overview of our proposal, which is a non-action item tonight, that proposes a planning year next school year, followed by district-wide implementation in 24-25. I'll pass it on to the team.
All right, thank you. My name is Andy Ratliff. I'm the Chief Financial Officer for the district, and we're going to go through a presentation about the FY 23-24 budget. First item, just real quick, rehash the timeline. Today's meeting, we're introducing the budget to you guys, and on the meeting on the 21st of February, we plan on hopefully getting approval for that. It has to be to the assembly by the first Monday in March, and their approval is set, I believe it's around, I think it's March 21st or so is the assembly meeting, which they'll have it approved. Aside from that, we're just watching the state legislative updates, try to get a feeling where the legislature might go with any sort of revenue increases or other changes in educational funding. So we did update this slide. You guys have seen this for quite a while now. Really, it just shows the BSA over time since 2017 and how we've shored up the budget, and as well as what the BSA would be based on inflation. We did update this to the new inflation numbers that came out for 2022, which is about 8.1%. So that's that red line, and the dotted line there really just shows what our previous projection was. So that's the 2% historical inflation growth that we saw, and we kept the 2% historical for 23 and 24 as well. So as you can see, the inflation-proof BSA is about a $1,268 increase of what that would be. As you see, some of the legislative bills that came around, SB 52 had about $1,000 BSA increase. Part of the hard part of predicting what we'll actually need in a BSA increase is where contracts settle. Those typically lag inflation by a year or two, depending on when they're bargained. So if you see a high inflation year, a lot of times those contracts are more likely to follow suit after high inflation. But that's really what we're kind of looking at now is our CPI bit really high, and it's trending that way for 23 so far too, but we're waiting to see what the final numbers are. So we do have a balanced budget. We did address what ended up being about a $48 million deficit after we got it down from the original 68 that we had projected in July. We are reusing the remaining $20 million in ESSER money, as well as maximizing the one-time funding through fund balance to alleviate any major disruptions to our educational system. We do have a PTR increase of +1 at grades K-12, And there's a lot of other moving pieces in this budget too. This is probably one of the more complex ones that I've done since I've been here, with just the sheer number of positions and department reorganizations. Not necessarily new things, but a lot of shifting pieces in this budget. And then the shifting between funding sources between ESER and then back in the general fund, all that. It's just so it looks like a lot of moving pieces on paper. So it does look busy when we're starting to look at these slides and how the budget was compiled. So our final efforts to get to a balanced budget, we did increase our revenue about $4 million based on from the pro forma estimate. This is going to include increase based on our demographic projections, higher intensive needs students, and we also added in some pre-K ADM that was from the Alaska Reads Act, the halftime ADM that we get from that for students that aren't covered under special ed or other federal programs. So we think we were able to increase our revenue by about $4 million. We increased our attrition estimates by another $1 million or so from what we had in our pro forma budget, which was a $2.5 million increase in attrition. So that's up to about a $3.5 million increase over FY23. And for those of y'all listening that may not be familiar with attrition, it is our estimate of how many positions are going to go unfilled all year, how many people might waive medical insurance, and then just any position vacancies we have throughout the year. So really just all these unfilled positions and folks who waive medical insurance, all those are kind of add up to quite a bit. And as we increase some of the staffing in some of our areas, we think we're more comfortable in increasing that attrition estimate too, as some of those staff that were increased within the special education realm, those are some of the harder to fill positions as well. We want the flexibility to be able to hire those positions if we can, but from what we can see, we're taking the tack that some of those may not all get filled. And then we scaled back some of our FY23 ESER funded programs, ASD virtual, summer school, IT, and then some of the mental health. For the mental health, it gets a little bit more complicated. In our ESER budget, we allocated about $2 million into mental health. I know the board had said, spend up to $5 million. We don't think we can get to that point. So we ended up creating a budget for about $2.5 million or $2 million. And then of that $2 million, we brought about $1.5 million or so from ESER into there. We did have some other ads and some other position alignments, but we'll get to that later. We want to show a complete picture of mental health, and Dr. Knudsen's here to address how that department's going to function. The other thing we did is we had some decreases in the district administration and operations, and then we closed Abbott Loop and Ursa Major for FY24. Ursa Major being temporary until we really find out more about what that facility is going to be like and what it will take to get it back online. So not really sure on the timeline on that. So those are the big moving pieces that we had to get to a balanced budget. The general fund revenue, if you can see that, there's some fairly large changes here. The first one being the local property taxes. That's an $8.6 million increase, about 4%. This is almost entirely due to the required local contribution, about 7.8 million or so. That is the required local amount, which is also reduced directly from state funding. So as that required local contribution goes up, state money goes down. About 900,000 or so is going to be just part of the additional local contribution that we can collect. State revenue decreased by about the other $45 million question in there is the fund balance. That includes both the 16 million plus that we received in one-time funding for this year, as well as the 28 plus million that we had in fund balance to get down to the board minimum 8%. So that's really how we ended up balancing our budget, was just using fund balance and kicking the can down the road, so to speak. Foundation funding for the state, that's dropped by about 3.9 million. And that has a bunch of moving pieces too. So about 4.8 million we reduced based on reduction of the hold harmless provision that we were triggering for FY23, and some of the school size adjustments went down for the regular ADM. We had an increase of about 4.2 million for intensive needs funding, an increase of about 2.3 million for correspondence funding, and about a $2.2 million increase was the result of the $30 BSA increase. And then again, we lost about 7.8 million from the required local contribution shifting from the state to the city. The other point to note would be federal impact aid, about a $700,000 loss there, and that's based on the number of students living on base on JBEAR during the final or the count period. So we added this new slide really because if you're like me, and I'm sure all of you have gotten the question of why do my property taxes keep going up, but the school district keeps asking for more money? I'm sure you've all gotten that question many times. So we did this graph to really kind of illustrate that point. So the blue line going up is the required local contribution that the city has paid since 2017 up to 2024. And that's gone up about $17 million over the course of that time. It's also, the state revenue's gone down by that much. So ASD doesn't perceive any additional funding. It's really just, we stay flat because the required local contribution, the local government pays more and the state government pays less. So that's really what we're trying to illustrate with this, is to say, yeah, your taxes have gone up because the state recognizes you have inflation on these home prices and takes it out of the required local contribution. However, that's really where their recognition of inflation has stopped. So it's that. So really just trying to paint that picture of why taxes go up, but the district still needs more money. It's because we're flat funded even with that tax going up because the state's paying less. And then we have inflation on the other issues, labor, utilities, paper, insurance, everything just costs more. Pupil transportation, we got a balanced budget there. Really about a $2 million increase, about 8% overall on our revenue and expenditures. Most of that's going to be shored up with fund balance that we've gained through just savings by not being able to fill routes, by the contractor not filling routes, and this is just kind of savings over time. So we think we'll have about $2.5 million to help shore up that budget, and that'll allow us to reduce our tax request for transportation by about $500,000. So really just trying to find money where we can and keep our property taxes and limit the increase to the property taxes as much as we can. But that required local contribution is going to be a pretty big hit. Student nutrition, about a 3.7% increase overall. The biggest moving pieces on that is the lunch sales and breakfast sales, as those are trending down. And it looks like pretty steep changes. And really the reasoning behind this is in FY22, lunches for all students were free through a federal program. So, you know, my kids pay for free whenever they wanted to go. But that's counted as local revenue and as part or local lunch sales and part of that. So as they're projecting out FY23 back in FY22, they were using the same kind of methodology of saying, you know, here's what we think we're going to get based on this, what's happening now. As we look forward, and that program's gone away for even this year, it looks like we're going to sell far less meals as fully paid meals. However, we do expect our lunch reimbursements from the federal government to go up as far as the federal program, which will balance that out. So we do have a balanced budget and food service as well. So this chart shows our expenditures by state function for next year. By and large, our costs are going into direct instruction, special education, and ops and maintenance. Those are the three highest things. District administration is about 1% of that total, and district administration support is about 5.7%. District administration encompasses superintendent, school board, some of the chiefs, and I believe communications, and some assessment and evaluation costs. The administration support is services like payroll, accounting, budget, HR, IT, purchasing, warehouse, those sort of functions. Most of the other costs are within the schools. So that's kind of the color coding we have. The brownish bars are what's predominantly in schools, and then the blue bars are what's more district office. About 85% of our budget is going to salaries and benefits, and about 5.3% on utilities and rent, and that's most of our costs. So if you hear folks talking about, well, can we just give you a flat increase to pay for insurance? Insurance and other stuff's about 0.8%. So the biggest elephant in the room is that salaries and benefits. We're a people-heavy industry. We need people to do the work. but really this chart just kind of highlights where our costs are at by function and by type. So this will be our PTR going in for into next year with the +1 at all grade levels. It resulted in about a reduction of 62 FTE overall. We did use remaining ESSER funds to help balance the budget and use the source of about 164 positions. And we put them all at middle and high schools. There's an Appendix G at the back of the budget book that'll compare ESSER and general fund for FY23 against ESSER and general fund for FY24. So you can really kind of paint the picture of here's the total change in teaching FTE at the school. If you look at the individual budget pages in the budget book, you're going to it won't really tell the same story because it's just looking at the general fund and not all funding sources. With the ESSER funding, our intent was to really kind of make that more manageable. We pulled all the high value programs that we're doing into the general fund for this year, and then just use the rest of the remaining money on teachers. And that'll be a lot easier for us to manage internally, as well as going forward, having those costs already allocated in the general fund for like the CCL projects, mental health, those things, just trying to get those in our budget going forward. And then we'll address the teachers as we go along. So other staff allocations at elementary schools. PTR remained the same from 17 to 23. We increased it by 1 for this year, of course. Abbott, Loop, and Ursa Major were taken out of the budget for 24. You'll still see some costs in there for utilities, predominantly to keep the lights, water, and heat on so the building doesn't fall into too much disrepair. We added 12 teaching positions to support language immersion schools. I know we spent a lot of time this fall looking at language immersion and how much are the additional costs that does. So we decided to go ahead and be transparent, put those FTE into the schools before we were taking them out of a holdback pool. And this will give us more flexibility with that holdback pool going in. So when we have these bubbles of high class sizes, we can allocate more staff going forward. But for this year, a lot of our holdback our flexibility was kind of limited by having to shore up some of those neighborhood programs with the immersion programs in them. About 1.5 FTE were just changes on enrollment. So we didn't have a whole lot of changes overall based on enrollment, but in elementary is 1.5, and then 38 teacher reductions based on PTR increase. Middle schools really didn't have hardly any changes to the overall program. We added 5.2 teachers due to enrollment changes. They are projected to increase for next year. And then 8.8 got reduced for the PTR. High schools, similar. We added 0.2 teaching FTE based on the metric for the enrollment, and then reduced 13 PTR or FTE due to the PTR. Due to the other metrics for principals and counselors and security, we did make a few other changes there. As you can see, South High is slated to lose a principal and a clerical that's tied to that principal, but increase a counselor based on the different, just how that metric falls. And then a couple changes in security. Alternative schools, the FTE reduced due to enrollment was 6, and then the FTE reduced due to the PTR was 2.4. We made a few changes, and the biggest changes on here are with ASD Virtual, which I think it's probably a good time to let Sven take over and discuss kind of the changes that we are proposing for that program.
So with ASD Virtual, we are proposing getting rid of both the elementary and middle school components of ASD Virtual, and then moving the high school component to a rebranded Paideia. This will allow us to save close to between $1.3 and $1.5 million. We are looking at providing a couple supports that aren't with ASD Virtual in the Paideia model so that our kids would be supported at that high school level.
Okay. Next slide. So our general fund, this is kind of the aggregation of our school-based changes for the general fund, the immersion teachers, the changes based on enrollment, and then the PTR change. And then on this, we also have the staff reductions from the school closures. That's Abbott Loop and Ursa Major closing, the 2 principals, clerical, librarians, nurses. I've gone through those models in some detail, but savings about 14 FTE and 1.3 million. We were able to add 8 preschool classrooms too, as we shifted funding from a state grant. We had a state grant that was going away in lieu of the READS Act. So we pulled in those programs, or for next year, we'll pull in those pre-K programs into the general fund and then use that increased revenue from the half ADM BSA to fund them. So happy about that, to be able to continue those pre-K programs. And then the total other changes, that's the ones we went through with the principal, counselors, clerical, all those other things that were on those previous sheets. The 5.21 paraprofessionals on there, I would say that that is more of a metric when we talk about the kindy classrooms and noon duties, as our standard for a kindy classroom is a 3.5 hour TA per classroom, and then we add 2 hours onto that for noon duty. So as we project maybe a little bit lower in kindergarten, number of kindergarten classrooms, that's why that goes down. If the classrooms are there, we are going to hire those folks though. They're not, it's not a real high cost, but we want to make sure that we have one in every classroom. And then the charter school changes was only 0.3 FTE, but the cost was 2.8 million. That's predominantly within our correspondence schools, where they had a really high increased enrollment, and they're projecting to keep their enrollment increased. And most of that money goes towards reimbursements for families for classes or whatever they're buying. It's just kind of just the allotments paid to families, essentially what it is. On the special services, we added a couple of hard of hearing teachers. There's a 0.06 in clerical that was just adjusted for like an hour change or something for an employee. And then we put in some money for contracted services for sign language interpreters. We slight increase in the gifted parapros and other testing services. The Whaley staffing, it shows losing 2 FTE. That was something we did this year. There was a board memo that went through that took out the paraprofessionals and added intervention coaches and a counselor. That was a programmatic change that Whaley wanted. We've added some speech language staff, OT, PT staff, and then some intervention coaches at elementary. And then we added a teacher and counselor to the ACT program. We did reduce the English language learners transition support clerk. It was a vacant position that's been out there for a while. And then the native education changes that were made were also done on that board memo with Whaley. So that was something that they brought forward and supported and tried to make it cost neutral. And the other things we added were special education substitutes and some money for recruitment and retention to just try to get these folks up from out of state. So administration changes, we reduced a position out of equity. We reorganized teaching and learning and ended up adding 1 position. There's in our appendix C, they'll have all these lined out, all the different changes, but that was the net change, was an increase of 1, about 182,000 total. We eliminated a high school education director, then added some money in for secondaries training and professional learning communities and inclusive practices. Reduced an ops and maintenance assistant director, 14 custodians that were vacant. Those mostly were substitute custodians. So typically the ones that would rove around when someone called in sick or something, but those have been vacant for a long time. Reduced a couple of maintenance FTE, eliminated a gifted supervisor, and then here are the changes for the ASDV administration, which was a director, a couple coordinators, 2 ISD staff, and then adding a teacher expert. Other position changes, we did reclass a couple positions for a total of about 62,000. And those are all listed in that appendix C. So you'll see kind of the ins and outs there. But then other service supplies and equipment with administration, we reduced by about 100,000. You'll see the school resource officers coming off, and then the district-wide attrition that we talked about earlier then we're expecting our insurance costs to go up by about $500,000. So overall, about 24 positions coming out, about 6.64 million in savings. So our mental health department, this is really to help support the board goals and guardrails. We stood up the mental health department with several existing positions that were shifted from special education and other departments. There were and then half position that was paid for by ESER, with a lot of the contracted services and other things that we're looking to do. And Jenny will get into really how that's going to look in the fall. But really, the total budget is about $3.5 million. And while not in this budget particularly, when you see the admin costs in there, they are taking over the supervision of the psychology department, which is also a large staff. So don't want to lose sight that this isn't their only locus of control, but they do have other responsibilities. So I'll turn it over to Jenny to speak to some of the great things we're doing.
Thank you, Andy. So to talk a little bit about the reorganization, you'll see those behavior strategists and behavior analyst positions, and those are coming to us from special education. And that was really an effort to better coordinate our behavior supports for students so that when students are struggling behaviorally, that we can deploy experts into buildings to really help school-based support staff. So these are not new positions, they're positions that have been in play, but what we're doing is better coordinating them with our school psychology services, counseling services, and that continuum of mental and behavioral health. So those are those first two. The other piece too that you'll see is a large portion under mental health senior director, but it's mostly under contracted support. This is addressing board guardrail 4.2 about increasing the number of community clinicians in buildings. So this gives them basically startup money to get that going while they get started until they get their billing cycles and that going with Medicaid and those types of funding sources. So that's the money that came from ESER into our general fund that we're going to be continuing to work with our community clinicians through both our Project Aware grant as well as general fund to increase that and meet our guardrail 4.2. And then finally, you'll see some mental health changes. We have one director, and that is Kate McClellan, and she came over from healthcare services, and she's really heading up our mental health supports. She went from a senior director to a director, so that was some cost savings, but she's really coordinating with our community clinicians as well as some other projects around mental health and integrating that into our school-based PBIS and multi-tiered systems of supports. Two assistants director, one moved over from teaching and learning in our SEL department, and she's really working on the coordination. When I talked about the real intensive tier 3 supports that our behavior analysts and strategists are providing, she's really helping us with those tier 1 and tier 2 supports. So we really have a continuum of behavioral supports for all kids across our schools. And then one of the other assistant directors is really focusing on the elimination of seclusion and the reduction of restraint in the district, and really also helping with those behavior strategists and analysts and how we better use them and coordinate those services. So again, a lot of this work is really about, we had a fragmented system where different providers were in different departments. We're now coordinating that together to provide a more uniform system for our schools. And then positive thing is we added on 3 more school counselors, and that will be at the elementary level, and that will serve an additional 6 schools. So we're in the process of working on that right now. So again, that's addressing board guardrail 4.1, where we're increasing the amount of mental health, internal mental health supports within our schools. So really this structure is helping support that guardrail from the school board. Thank you.
All right. And lastly, we have just a list of the items that we pulled in from ESER funding. It's really some new hire induction money, the mental health that Jenny just spoke of. And while it says mental health senior director, it's not just her, that's the contract cost too that we pulled in. She's not quite 1.6 million. We pulled in reading interventionists, the high value push-in supports there. The technology, people and the software and the devices, all those costs we pulled in. And the amount that you see here on these aren't necessarily what we had budgeted budgeted in the Easter funding. A lot of these are at lesser amounts because we're just trying to wind down some of these programs that were started up during COVID. And you'll see the virtual teachers brought in at 8.8. That was about, we had 20 or so in Easter money. And the classroom teachers, we brought in 313 of the 477. So that's the difference, is the 164 that we're going to leave out there in secondary schools. So then lastly, I think Mr. Gustafson's going to discuss moving sixth grade to middle school.
So we are bringing this to you in this work. It started as a conversation around the budget early on, and we wanted to update you just as why we're asking for a different kind of pathway for moving sixth grade to middle schools. We have gone over with you the benefits of moving sixth grade to middle school before. One of the things that, as we really got looking into it and starting to dive into what all has to happen to be able to move sixth graders to middle school, we realized that it is very extensive and it would be easier to do all of the schools at one time. So we're asking that we have a non-action memo this evening that asks you to approve giving us 1 year to do all the planning and get all the logistics figured out, and then moving the remaining sixth graders into middle school during the following fiscal school year. Just some things right on this sheet that we would look at as benefits is just the more options we talked about, more options in CTE, world language, fine arts, being able to have more music options in the middle school, increased PE and health, looking at our wellness policy. Having a 3-year experience at middle school is pretty nice. And then just kind of some of the things that we have to think about as we're looking at moving, even down to making sure our fifth grade teachers are trained, is to have recommendations for classes. That's kind of extensive because there's a lot of those fifth grade teachers that have to do that. I'm just looking at both the elementary and the middle schools, making sure it's a really good, smooth transition for the kiddos and the families as we move those kids in. It makes it easier to do it in 1 year rather than 2 because of the fact of some of our schools, actually, some of our elementaries have multiple middle schools that they go to. And if we were to split those up, it would be problematic and possibly a second second shift of the boundaries the second year, and we'd rather do that all at once. So anyways, we're bringing this to you today because it did start in budget, but we don't believe that it really is a budgetary item more so than just an item that's good for kids.
All right, thank you, Dr. Bryant and team. And thank you, board members, for being patient and holding your questions. I think it was benefit to getting all that information at once. For the record, I did want to note that we've been joined by Member Wilson at 4:01 p.m., Member Holloman at 4:12 p.m., and Member Higgins online at 4:20 p.m. Questions? Member Donnelly, start with you.
Go back to the slide that showed the division of the budget from salaries and benefits, utilities, insurance, supplies. I just was taking some notes there and I went a little fast. And could I again request that this slide bank be provided to us by email? Yeah, yeah, that'd be helpful. I'm trying to decide about the policy behind the increased number of our instructors in some locations, and while an overall increase in the PTR. So I guess I need to think about what kind of questions I have about that more, Mr. Chairman. Thanks.
Okay, we'll come back to you, Member Donnelly. Other questions in the room, Member Wilson?
I have a list, but I will go through them, not all at once. The J-Bear loss of students, did I hear that correctly? That there was a decrease in the amount of students at J-Bear?
That's correct. It's kind of been happening slowly over time. We have seen some declines in the number of students on base.
I was just curious if we're expecting those to increase. I didn't know if it was due to kind of COVID related, whether or not we had more families coming in, less families coming in at the time, but we anticipate that to increase, or is the projection for a decreased number of students?
Well, the number of students is not necessarily a projection. They take the count this year. We submit it to the Impact Data Office based on this year's data. So it's actually current students that are being submitted for next year. So we're relatively confident in the number of students declining.
Thank you.
But I don't know as far as kind of ongoing what the projection is for on base.
I guess my question is over the last couple of years, have we seen a slight decline in students on J-Bear? Thank you.
And then Member Wilson, do you have a second question? Maybe we'll go two at a time.
I do. I did note, or I wrote some notes, 75 ASD bus drivers and 131 Reliant bus drivers. Did I get that correct? It was at the bottom of one of the slides. I wrote down 175 ASD bus drivers and 131 Reliant.
75 ASD and 131 Reliant.
I wasn't sure. Are those all full-time positions? Or some of those part-time or on-call? I don't know how that's phrased. Or
I'm not exactly sure on the Reliant ones, but I know the ASD ones are based on the number of hours per route, and it varies between like 6 and 8, I think. And Mr. Anderson's.
Right, that's the total number of routes. That doesn't include all the subs and everybody else that's been hired, but that's the number of routes after we modified the routes at the beginning of this year, taking out some of the stops and making it go a little bit further in order to minimize the total requirement of buses.
Okay, so for clarification, so I heard that correctly. That's the number of routes that either the ASD or Reliant bus drivers are driving, or
that is the number of routes that we're operating.
Not necessarily the number of specific
that is correct.
Bus drivers. Thank you.
Thank you, Member Wilson. Member Lessons.
I guess I have one question and then a comment. So my question actually was at the very end regarding the 6th grade to middle school move, causing changes in bus route sort of evaluation planning. Are we then considering a whole district boundary change experience, or only with respect to middle school? Can you just speak to that?
I don't believe we're looking at a whole district boundary changes, just in respect to middle school, making sure we have those boundaries, being the most efficient.
Member Lessons, do you have a follow-up question or comment?
I have a follow-up comment. I was really struck. So I was in Juneau this weekend with Member Wilson, and one of the presentations we received gave us an overview of how education funding looks across the state. And I compared the state's pie chart with ASD's pie chart. And just looking at this, we spend half as much on district administration as districts across the state. We spend significantly more on instruction than districts across the state. And that was an interesting talking point with some of our legislators. That's really more of a reflection than a comment, than a question.
Thank you, Member Lessons. Member Holloman, any questions?
I've got a couple in regards to middle school. For the K through 5th graders that are staying at the elementary, does music look the same to them after the 6th graders leave? When we're talking about the change in music instruction, we're looking at like 6th grade band and orchestra. And
that's part of why we need to have that extra year of planning, Mr. Holloman.
Okay.
There's a lot of moving parts that we have to look at.
Okay. And then the other question is, for the 6th graders that go to middle school, does this look like 7th and 8th grade middle school with 6th graders, or is 6th grade a little bit different?
So I would just look at what we do in Baggage, Clark, and Mirror Lake currently with our 6th graders. They have a little difference. but it is middle school and we're trying to give them the middle school experience.
Okay, so they'd have 4 core
It
classes
would
and
be the
elective
same like
classes.
that, yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Member Holloman. We'll transition online. President Bellamy, your hand's raised.
Yes, thank you. I have a couple of questions, and then I'd like if you could review the property tax slide again at the end of these couple of questions. So my first question is there a scenario where we would bring back programs? And I'm thinking programs like the elementary version of ASDV. That's one question. And then a follow-up question for that is, how are we preparing K-8 ASDV staff for the change if this budget passes? Because they would be displaced, correct?
Yes, so the K-8 teachers would be in the displaced list of teachers. The high school designated teachers would move over to the rebranded Paideia. As far as bringing back...
Now,
I'm sorry.
I'm thinking... No. So my question really has to do with, is there a scenario where anything that we cut, such as ASDV, could be brought back? Is there a scenario? Is there a budgetary scenario in looking at what happens in Juneau?
I can take a stab at this. So if I understand correctly, Madam President, the question is, if we were to receive more funding, is there a list of what we'd bring back first and when? And I think that really depends on the level of funding and all of the different scenarios that we're looking at as it relates to the next fiscal year. Because as the board is aware, next year's fiscal cliff will be larger than this year's because of cost of living adjustments for our employees and other factors. So it would need to be quite a substantial increase for anything to be added back, and it would need to be a structural increase to the base student allocation and not just a huge sum of one-time funding. Those two differences create very different scenarios.
Okay. All right. I think that kind of answers the question. I know at one point, I think we had a little bit of a discussion about, what things might we be able to restore if we did get extra funding. So what I'm hearing is that it would depend on lots of things that are still unknown.
Correct.
Okay, so could Andy, I'm sorry, could you quickly review that property tax slide again? I think I missed the important piece of it. That one, yeah.
Sure. So this slide really just shows the change in the required local contribution from 2017 to 2024. And this is set based on the property values in Anchorage. So we take the full and true value of property taxes and multiply it by 2.65 mils. And whatever the local property taxes, the required local contribution is, the state reduces that amount from our foundation funding. So in 2017, they took $103 million away from us from foundation funding. In 2024, they took $120 million, or they will take $120 million out of our foundation funding. So our property taxes do keep going up, and you hear that from the public a lot. And this is why. It doesn't result in any net increase in funding to the district because the state takes it away from us through the foundation formula. I'll also add, in 2017, our additional local contribution which is the amount above the required local that the city can provide, was 101 million, almost 102 million. In 2024, it's a little under 101 million. So that hasn't increased at all. It's actually gone down over that amount. But we're limited on how much we can collect on state statute because it's also tied to the foundation formula. So as we've declined in the number of students, so has our ability to collect additional local contributions.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, President Bellamy.
I'm good.
Member Higgins, do you have any questions online?
Yeah, I can you hear me? Okay.
Gotcha. Yep.
Appreciate it. And I missed part of the very beginning. I had problems with the sound issues, and I apologize, but I was trying to read the closed captions. That was hard to do. And there was a number of things in here that jumped out. Let's talk about process first. This is being proposed. We get a large increase in the BSA, which is continuing on. What process are you proposing what we add back in? Is that something comes back to the board for the board to decide, or the administration gets to decide what they reverse in the cuts? Are we going to, when do we go through that process? Because I have some concerns about some of this, but I guess I want to know the process first. I think that President Bellamy made the comment about saying, wait a minute, what if we get this money, what comes back? Well, it seems like that's a board concern and issue, and we obviously have a role to play in approving that. And is that the plan? Is the idea which one of these are reversible and which ones are not if we approve this?
If I may comment, Member Higgins, as I stated with Madam President's question, very similarly, what we're looking at, the slide that's being displayed, is a huge gap between what structurally we're given from the state and what our actual costs are. So really, even a $1,200 BSA increase would just get us to the status quo. So I would push us as a board to not think about what we're adding back, but what do our students need? What are the research-based practices that we can put in our schools, regardless of whether or not they were previously in the school. So all of that to say, it would be a long process that would be very collaborative between the board and the administration. And it really depends, again, on whether it's a structural change to the base student allocation or a large sum of one-time funding. And it's just too early to tell what that scenario will be. And they result in very different outcomes, because if it is just a large sum of one-time funding, we should really have a frank conversation as a board as to whether or not we should restore anything or just brace for the larger structural deficit that'll be coming in the next fiscal year.
And I do not disagree, Superintendent, that if it's one-time funding, that would not be the best scenario at all for us. I look at this and I saw the classroom sizes from K through 12 going up by 1, but I've seen the studies nationally that says K through 3 is critical with the classroom sizes compared to before. In fact, the national study that I saw said that the 90% effectiveness of lower classroom sizes is achieved by lower classroom sizes K through 3. That 1 through K, increasing classroom sizes by 1, is that something that can be done from 4th grade on without going K through 3? Because that's obviously impacting our outcomes significantly. And I'm trying to say, what can we do to increase academic scores even under these conditions?
From a budgetary perspective, it's absolutely something that we can do. We would just have to see how many more teachers that would add back to the K1, 2, and then, or K3, and then, we'd have to take that from somewhere else. There's going to be other decisions that we'd have to make. As far as I'd kind of go back to your question about the process. If we do get more money, it'll be a similar process where see how much money that is, and then work between the administration and the school board to allocate it. Ultimately, it is a school board's decision on how to spend money. We would, just like any other time, we would say, here's our recommendation, then the board needs to affirm it.
Thank you, Member Higgins. We'll go back to the room. Member Donnelly, or do you have a question at this point formulated?
So looking out to next year on the middle school, change 6th graders to middle school. Earlier this budget cycle, when you were originally proposing that move, if we did not eliminate the so-called middle school model, which is the extra planning period, it was going to cost us more per student to move them to, and it was in millions of dollars, the extra costs. Is the plan you've got on the table now, as my understanding is, you're not eliminating the planning period, so it's going to, how much is the fiscal impact going to be of it?
I don't believe there was a cost to move, when we keep the middle school model, to move them from elementary to middle schools. And that's because when you look at the PTR at 6th grade, it's 28 and going to be 31.25. 6th grade at elementary is 28, and then the 31.25 is at middle school. So that PTR changes. That kind of washes out the additional FTE you need for the planning time. So as far as, and we've modeled that out, so when we move all those sixth graders into middle schools, it creates about the same FTE overall. The money savings that we recognize was, like you said, if we do cut that middle school model where they have 2 prep times, then it was savings of like 3.8 million or so when you moved the sixth graders in and then cut the model.
I really distinctly remember in some of our budget work sessions that there wouldn't be a cost saving unless the middle school model was eliminated, and actually was going to be a cost increase because of that. I see that maybe further analysis may have resulted from the lower pupil-teacher ratio in the elementary schools going to a higher pupil-teacher ratio in middle school, where it could offset that, but that wasn't clear at all previously. Thank you.
Thank you, Member Donnelly. I'll jump in. So question regarding that came up actually in Senate Education while members Wilson and Lessons were in Juneau that I think might provide perspective, and Senator Bjorkman asked. If, obviously to balance our budget, we've engaged in an exercise that's found us a number of efficiencies, cuts, and we're utilizing a significant amount of savings and one-time funds. If the only lever that we utilized to get us from the 68 million original deficit to zero was decreasing the amount of teacher FTE, what would that number be? Do we have a ballpark we can get today, or if not, can we get that in Board Connect? That'll work just fine.
Let me get out the calculator.
I figured you would be prepared.
It'd be about 575 FTE, give or take.
Thank you.
It's about at 118,000 or so per.
Thank you. And then a question regarding, we talked about potential Medicaid billing. And so I'm curious, and Dr. Knudsen, thank you for the information and the update on mental health services. Through Dr. Bryant, have we as a district identified a target that we're shooting for in terms of what we can expect? It seems to be one of the very few levers that we have as a district to generate additional funding outside of the foundation formula and local contributions. So
for Medicaid billing specifically?
Correct, yes, ma'am.
I would have to get more information for you about that because there's 2 different types of Medicaid. There's school-based Medicaid, and then there's the Medicaid that our behavioral health is billing for. And so they're 2 totally separate systems that I would need more people here to help explain that and to be able to do, but there isn't a projected goal or anything for that.
Fair enough, thank you. Okay, well, we are at 4:52, so we have a few minutes left. I'll open up for a second round of questions. I see Member Lessons, then Member Holloman's hand up.
Not a comment, but not a question, but a comment. I was really struck by page 13 of the big budget book that we received, and that has the long-term financial planning where it sketches out what the deficits may look like with FY 25, 26, and 27. And there were ranges that were posited for each of those years. And I think they're dire. So to the earlier question, about what could we put back in our schools, I think I deeply understand what you're saying, Dr. Bryant, that we really can't even consider putting things back, even with one-time funds or with an increase that doesn't meet our needs. So the long-term situation to me is pretty bleak.
Thank you, Member Lessons. Member Holloman, then we'll go to Member Higgins.
You mentioned the shift for students from ASD virtual to Padea, and I was wondering, I know a lot of students use ASD virtual part-time. Are they going to be able to utilize Padea that way? Or?
Yes, the whole high school program that we have will move over and be utilized. We had about 1,500 students utilize those courses.
Okay, so to make sure I'm understanding, say a student service that was taking a couple of ASD virtuals, they would remain a service student, but be able to access it via Padea.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Member Holloman. Member Higgins, we're engaging in a speed round of questions. Do you have a quick follow-up?
Yeah, thank you. The idea of the 6th graders moving into the middle schools, but we're but use basically more junior high model. And the example given for middle school going up to 113% of the capacity, but that we can make do. It's the goal here of shifting them is to make more elementary schools so that we can close them, because it seems like we're going to have lower capacity in the elementary, over capacity in the middle school and junior high, in my opinion. And I'm just trying to really grasp what's going to be the impact on the elementary, and is in the plan here, is that's creating more opportunities to close more neighborhood schools?
I can speak to that through the chair to Member Higgins. At a high level, the intent is to not expedite a consolidation plan for elementary schools. Our intent is to really utilize the expanded access to academic and extracurricular enrichment for students. That's really the spirit of why we're proposing moving the 6th grade students to middle school and maintaining the middle school model so that our middle school teachers have an avenue to prepare and provide strong instruction. That was the intent with middle school. It's not directly related to any sort of consolidation plan, but as you noted, it will have an impact on capacity at the elementary level.
Thank you, Member Higgins. Member Wilson, your hand was up.
Just a couple quick questions, hopefully. Student nutrition was one of the slides. Does the amount that was shown for student nutrition, does that consider summer school meal programs as well? Or is that just the calendar year?
I believe it does include summer program. You can see the federal sources. We do have a line for summer programming. It's about 350,000 or so.
And a quick second question, hopefully quick. Can you explain what a holdback pool is?
So a holdback pool would be, we just have a pool of teachers. I believe there's 31 FTE that we don't assign or staff until we kind of see where the holes are in people's schedules, or if we have a class bubble of like 34 or something, like an elementary class that we don't have, just a larger class we need to split out or something. So it's really just these unhired positions. So we don't hire them until we need them, really to kind of fill this void that we see for either higher class sizes and bubbles or to help out with some scheduling issues. But it's really just teachers that are not hired yet that we can push out to.
Thank you, Member Wilson. I'll jump in real quick here. I want to go back to the property tax slide really quick. Do we know, or is that an apples to apples comparison for doing the math? The 16.9 million, I think I understand that that reduction in state funding has occurred since the last time the BSA increased, and that's almost exclusively because property values in the Anchorage area have risen, correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. Is there a back of the envelope math that we have prepared as to what that effectively does per $100,000 value of a home for Anchorage taxpayers?
I don't have that offhand, but I can certainly work that up.
Thank you. All right, Member Donnelly, we'll have time for one more question.
Yeah, and that same, if the BSA is significantly increased, it'll result in the availability or the authorization for local governments to increase what they contribute. Isn't that correct?
Yes.
Have we done a calculation of what the current legislative proposals would result in increases on local taxes?
We can certainly do those. The issue that we run into, though, is we have to submit our budget in March. And when we submit that, it's going to have, based on the budget that we've built here, with a $30 increase. And they're going to set their mill levies in April. So by the time the legislature actually makes any sort of recommendation on funding changes, we've already set the tax rates. So we don't have an ability to go back and collect what an additional allowable contribution might be. But really kind of the back of the envelope math on that is whatever the BSA increase is times 73,000, which is about our adjusted ADM, is how much state money we would get. And then the additional local allowable is 23% of that number. So certainly happy to walk through this.
Yeah,
in more detail later.
The BSA increase times
the BSA increase times the adjusted ADM, which is a little over 73,000. So if we get $1,000 BSA increase, we get about $73 million of new state money. And then in local authority, you could get up to another almost 17 million. However, there's a local tax cap that would prevent us from increasing it by 17 million above what the required local is, as well as just the timing of it isn't suitable for actually getting that in our tax request.
But there'd be a 1-year delay before that went into effect.
Potentially, but then we're still limited by the local tax cap.
Okay.
Thank you, Member Donnelly. Thank you, Dr. Bryant and team. The time is 5 o'clock, so we will end our work session, but we need to first adjourn into executive session. So I would entertain a motion to adjourn into executive session for the purpose of legal updates, negotiations, and contracts.
Well, Mr. Chair, I move that we adjourn to executive session for legal updates, negotiations, and contracts.
Second.
Made by Member Holloman, seconded by Member Lessons.